If you can't already tell, Rick and Morty is one of my favorite shows of all time. I've talked several times now on the channel about how much I love this show, but like any other series, there are always a few bad episodes. Despite what many people will tell you, I think Rick and Morty has managed to stay consistently great throughout its 9 seasons. But even I can't defend some of the episodes throughout the series, so today we'll be breaking down the top 10 worst episodes of Rick and Morty. I know I'm going to get a lot of backlash for this, but at number 10 we have the pilot. But please, just hear me out because I don't hate this episode at all. The pilot is a perfectly serviceable introduction to Rick and Morty, but that's really all it is at the end of the day. We barely get a glimpse of the characters, and we almost see nothing of the insane multiverse that would eventually define the series. I usually look back fondly on pilot episodes, but Rick and Morty's has always just been okay to me. The humor still holds up surprisingly well, but the story just doesn't come close to anything the show would eventually do later on. When I think of Rick and Morty, I think of all the creative sci-fi concepts and clever parodies that they do. It's a show all about subverting your expectations and pushing the boundaries of what sci-fi storytelling can do. But the pilot doesn't really do any of that at all. By design, it's a very straightforward and forgettable adventure. You want to go simple with the first episode of your series, but you don't want to go so simple that the rest of the series completely overshadows you. Another thing that is very distracting on a rewatch are Rick and Morty's voices themselves. Justin Roiland clearly hadn't figured out the voices yet, and you can tell because Rick and Morty sound very strange. But I hate to be negative the whole time because like I said, I don't hate this episode at all. This is still the beginning of Rick and Morty, so it'll always have a place in my heart. The biggest problem with this episode is that Rick and Morty just continue to raise the bar afterwards. Looking back, the pilot feels like a rough draft of the series instead of a proper representation of what it would later evolve into. But hey, at least this is the only episode on the list that I actually like, so there's that. It's all downhill from here. The President is a recurring character in Rick and Morty that I really like. Keith David is awesome, and he does a fantastic job in the role. But for some reason, they put him in some of the worst episodes of the entire show. Season 3 is easily the peak of Rick and Morty's popularity and contains some of the best episodes of the show. Unfortunately, the season finale is not one of these episodes. The previous episode, The ABCs of Beth, ends with Rick offering Beth the chance to create a clone of herself. Beth's decision is left ambiguous at the end of the episode. The Rick, Chury, and Morty date chooses to follow up this plotline in possibly the most half-assed way ever. Beth received a lot of character development throughout Season 3, mainly through the subplot involving her divorce with Jerry. We got to see Beth all on her own for the first time, and we quickly realized that she doesn't know who she is. Rick offers to create the clone to give the real Beth a chance to go discover herself. And while the Season 4 finale does something really cool with this plotline, for some reason the episode that immediately follows completely fumbles. Beth becomes paranoid after she figures out that she may be a clone, so she decides to go back to Jerry. The first 2 seasons did such a good job at building up to this divorce, so to undo it in just one episode feels infuriating. Maybe it could have worked out if the entire episode focused on Beth's dilemma, but that's not what we got. The rest of the episode heavily features the President, which as I said earlier is a great character, and they really explore his dynamic with Rick in this one. Most of the episode is just Rick screwing with the President, and honestly, it's really funny. There are a lot of good gags. And the final few minutes honestly has one of the coolest action scenes in the entire series, with both Rick and the President throwing everything they have at each other. I really enjoy this storyline. I just don't think it fits with the subplot at all. I would much rather spend time following Beth's clone storyline, but we have to make time for Minecraft and Reddit jokes. And yes, those jokes are funny, but they don't fit here in the finale of Season 3 at all. The Rick, Chury, and Morty date isn't a terrible episode, but it's a horrible follow-up to the ABCs of Beth and a really bad season finale. Season 4's finale did give us a much better conclusion to this storyline, but we still had to wait 3 years for that. And it does not excuse the failure of a finale that this episode is. At number 8, we have the best titled episode of Rick and Morty in history. How Poopy Got His Poop Back. Okay, so I'm just going to call him Mr. PB from this point onward because I am not saying that full name throughout the whole review. Mr. PB is definitely the standout character of Season 2, thanks to his many funny reappearances throughout the rest of the series. The Wedding Squanchers began a trend of having him appear at the end of each season, usually watching the series itself and directly addressing the audience. I think Mr. PB is at his best in small doses, but focusing an entire episode on him sounds like a really bad idea. And the Season 7 premiere pretty much immediately proved me correct. This episode sucks. To address the elephant in the room, Mr. PB, much like Rick and Morty, was recasted in between Seasons 6 and 7. And if you're new to the channel, then you should probably know that I think Ian Cardone and Harry Belden are great as the titular duo. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for John Allen, who is trying his very best to recreate Justin Moreland's voice for Mr. Poopy Butthole. And to be fair, the character's voice was already incredibly annoying because that was part of the joke. But now we also have to spend an entire episode with the character, so it just becomes unbearable. So apparently Mr. Poopy Butthole is an alcoholic now. I guess that happened. Sorry guys, it's just sorry. It's really hard to read this script without I can't. We need a break. So Mrs. Poopy Butthole, she took his son. She's filing for divorce and she took the kids. Okay, sorry about that. Where was I? Rick gets the gang back together to help cheer up Mr. PB and decide to take him on a guy's night out. This is a really fun concept for an episode, and we even get to see the reappearances of Bird Person, Squanchy, Gearhead, and Gene. But this episode really doesn't have the flair that makes Rick and Morty so special. Most of the episode boils down to the gang getting drunk and then acting stupid. And if that's your kind of humor, then more power to you. But I think the show is at its best when it blends together science fiction and some really dark humor. There's also some really random cameos in the episode. Surprisingly, Hugh Jackman actually voices himself, which is probably where most of the budget went. And I guess Amy rebounded with a predator from the action series of the same name. And I'm not really a fan of when Rick and Morty includes characters from other media into the series. Scary Terry is funny because he's not actually Freddy Krueger, he's just some knockoff. This episode really just feels like a bunch of random ideas thrown at the wall. And it all revolves around a character that we just really don't care about. And it really just kind of makes me regret dressing up like Mr. Poopy Butthole for Halloween 2017. Yes, I did that. Moving on. This is the most recent episode on the list, and when I first watched it, I could already tell I wouldn't like it. Season 8 is really good overall, but this episode stood out for just how bad it was. I am not a fan of the episodes that rely on gross out humor and sexual themes. And this episode is not nearly as bad as some of the other episodes that I'm going to talk about later, but that's not really a compliment. Jerry accidentally kills the Easter Bunny and then is transformed into it. Meanwhile, Rick and Morty travel across the world to discover the true meaning behind Easter. They discover the Easter Bunny was secretly sent by aliens to kill the world through overpopulation. And what ensues is a massive orgy all across the world, which is exactly what I wanted to see. This episode had a lot of potential to be good, but it's just kind of a mess. There is so much information dumping on the audience that anybody new to the show would be completely lost. And if you're not into the new lore they introduce about Easter, then there's really nothing to latch onto. Well, that is unless you enjoy watching the orgy. Like I said, the sex jokes just don't really work for me in this episode. And the way that this episode handles the new lore with Easter just kind of ruins it for me. It is just such a fast-paced episode that is throwing so much at you at once. And for that reason, I felt like it was a perfect contender for the list. I think the first 2 seasons of Rick and Morty are by far the best of the show. And Interdimensional Cable 2 is probably the only episode from these first 2 seasons that I genuinely dislike. The first Interdimensional Cable has held up as one of the greatest episodes of the show to this day. The potential of great comedy from Interdimensional Cable is basically limitless. And the first episode perfectly utilized these TV skits. They were hilarious, but they didn't overshadow the emotional moments. Beth and Jerry's emotional storyline in that episode holds up as one of the best in the series. It finally took Jerry and Beth's relationship in an interesting direction and developed them as people. Interdimensional Cable 2 was so bad that it killed the entire concept of seasonal releases. The skits just don't land like they did in part 1. Most of the jokes just end in graphic violence or repeat a joke from the first episode. And while Jerry is one of my favorite characters in the show, his storyline in this episode is just downright awful. After being saved by an alien doctor, Jerry discovers that he can donate his penis to save another man's life. Jerry spends the entire episode being a pathetic coward, but then he takes a hostage at the end to try to prove himself as a hero. I won't say it's out of character for Jerry, but it really just serves to highlight the worst parts of his personality. And it doesn't help that this is the same season that Jerry has some of his best plot lines in the show, and what you're left with is probably one of the most forgettable episodes of Rick and Morty. Season 7 honestly has a lot of great episodes and doesn't deserve all the hate that it gets. So it really bums me out to place another episode from that season on this list. Wet Qua Amortic Summer starts out with a pretty interesting plotline. The episode begins with Morty and Summer fighting over an attribute slider. If you've ever played a video game where you can level up the stats of your character, this is kind of how that works. However, if you increase one stat, there's a chance that another stat will dramatically decrease. If you're all brains, you have no brawn, and vice versa. Sadly, that concept is not what this episode focuses on. Very early on in the episode, Morty gets transformed into a Quado. This is a reference to the 1999 film Total Recall, which is actually a really good movie. And funny enough, another episode from Season 2 references this movie. Total Recall made it on my top 10 best episodes list for being one of the funniest and most creative episodes of the entire show. That episode took inspiration from the film, but you didn't have to watch it to understand the episode. And that's honestly my biggest problem with Wet Qua Amortic Summer. In Total Recall, the Quado can only say one phrase. This is all Morty says throughout the entire episode. It's not like the phrase "open your mind" is particularly funny or anything. It's a silly reference to the movie, but they completely run it into the ground. The episode relies so heavily on you already knowing what the film Total Recall is. The story is just complete nonsense about some black market Quado scheme. It's really just a bunch of nonsense. And there's really nothing special here for the Rick and Morty fans. Rick is honestly the only saving grace of this episode. There's some pretty funny bits about him doing a Taken parody. And while the dynamic between Rick and Summer isn't the main focus, there are some good moments here. Summer will never replace Morty, but she honestly brings a lot to the show. I think it's very sweet that Summer reminds Rick a lot of Diane. But really, I just don't have a whole lot to say about the quality of this episode. Frankly, the story does not interest me, and the jokes just don't land. Summer definitely deserves better episodes than this. Watching Season 5 live was one of the most disappointing experiences of my entire life. At this point in time, Rick and Morty was still my favorite show of all time. And week by week, my excitement for Season 5 slowly dwindled with each new episode. It felt like the show was losing its touch, and this episode seemed to solidify that for me. Gotron Jerry's Rick Van Gallion was the episode that truly broke me. I was this close to quitting the show. Had it not been for the next 3 episodes being so good, I probably would have given up right here. This episode is so bad, guys. I don't know how to even describe it. Parroting Voltron sounds like a really cool idea. But what the hell are we doing with this episode? There's like 10 different storylines going on at once and none of them fit together. It begins as a parody of Voltron before suddenly becoming a parody of The Godfather. And then it shifts focus to Morty, who is backstabbed by the rest of the family. These horribly generic anime characters show up and they're not funny at all. Rick and Summer turn the Gotrons into a multiversal business. We see all kinds of crazy different alternate versions of the Smith family. And then for no reason at all, this episode makes a callback to an even worse episode from Season 5. As much as I love Summer as a character, this episode highlights her in such a negative light. Summer backstabs literally everyone in the family just to appease Rick. She's incredibly vicious and cruel to Morty to a point that it's just hard to watch. But don't worry guys, there's a reason why Summer's acting so out of character. They brought back the incest baby, didn't they? Look, I could have looked past this episode if it was just a mediocre parody of Voltron or The Godfather, but what is this? Rick and Morty constantly makes fun of the fan base for wanting story-driven episodes. And out of all the plot lines, you choose the incest baby? And don't worry, I'll talk about that episode very soon. I just feel completely dumbfounded by how this episode even came to exist. If I had to say something nice about the episode, I would say that there's some pretty good animation, and there's like 2 good jokes. Okay, but that's all you get. It kind of makes me embarrassed to be a Rick and Morty fan. How the hell do you explain this episode to someone who has never watched the show? Yeah, so it's actually canon that Morty and Summer had a baby together and they named it Naruto. I think it's just for the better if we pretend this episode doesn't exist. Season 4 was a pretty average outing for Rick and Morty. It came out almost 2 years after Season 3, which was pretty easily the most popular season of the entire show. But Season 4's ratings began to dwindle slowly after the first episode, with a majority of the fan base actually dying out. Season 4 is often looked back on as one of the most forgettable seasons of the entire show, and I could see why. To give credit where it's due, Season 4 did at least give us the Vat of Acid episode, but I also look back on this season as the first one to truly have a terrible episode. Claw and Hoarder, Special Rickdom's Morty, is one of the worst titles for an episode I've ever heard in my life, and this episode honestly did irreparable damage to the brand of Rick and Morty. While I never stopped watching the show, a lot of people cite this as the episode that made them jump ship. And it's a shame because this episode had so much potential. After 3 seasons of strictly science fiction, the series decided to dip its toes into the world of fantasy. I could not wait to see what Rick and Morty's take on dragons would be. And then you finally watch the episode and you realize all Rick and Morty did was make a bunch of sex jokes for 20 minutes straight. The episode begins with Morty begging Rick for a dragon. And soon enough, Morty makes a deal with a wizard to obtain a dragon. Now, Morty has the right idea in this episode because he wants to take the dragon out on adventures and have fun. But Rick discovers that there's actually something else that this dragon really wants, and it's pretty disgusting. Admittedly, I do like a couple of moments in this episode. It's pretty funny to watch Rick hang out with the dragon and get up to a bunch of wacky hijinks. But it immediately loses me when Rick and the dragon decide to do a soul bond. For some reason in the Rick and Morty universe, dragons are incredibly, well, aroused. And in many certain ways, a soul bond is very gratifying for them. I don't really want to go into detail, but let's just say that it's a very hard episode to watch. As I already said, I don't really enjoy sexually explicit humor, especially in Rick and Morty. So I was pretty upset when I discovered that the so-called dragon episode was actually about kink shaming. Due to violating Morty's contract with the wizard, the dragon is sentenced to execution. So now Rick, Morty, and Summer have to travel to an uninspired fantasy dimension to undo the soul bond. This episode has to have one of the blandest takes on a fantasy realm that I've ever seen. There is not a remotely interesting or original concept in this entire episode. The writers introduce a cool element explaining that Rick's technology doesn't work in this dimension, and then they immediately undo it 5 seconds later. You would think with Rick's life on the line, the stakes would be high, but they're just not. Instead, the episode chooses to focus on how horny these dragons are. The only saving grace of this episode is the subplot, which is actually pretty good. As I previously said, Jerry is one of my favorite characters, and when he's used properly, he can be hilarious. It's nothing too complicated. Jerry just so happens to run into a talking cat, and while this is probably nothing new to Rick, it just blows Jerry's mind. We don't really find out the origins behind this cat, but I assume it was pretty messed up. I mean, it is no small feat to upset Rick Sanchez this much. This is honestly one of the best bits in the entire show, and it just barely saves this episode from making the bottom 2. Remember Get Swifty? How can you not after how big of a meme it's become? It even made it into Fortnite, so clearly people love this episode. And if you remember, this episode actually introduced us to Ice-T. And yes, I'm talking about the real-life rapper turned actor Ice-T. In that episode, they reveal that Ice-T is actually an alien from another planet. He's an ice elemental from the planet Alpha Beatrum. And no, I'm not making that up. Get Swifty ends with the gag that teases a sequel episode focusing on Ice-T. This is a really good gag that mocks the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The Marvel movies always end with the scene to set up the next film, even if nobody asked for it. That's how we got such great movies as Madam Web and Morbius. Looking back on the episode, this gag actually aged really well. But that great joke was ruined 5 seasons later when we somehow actually got a real sequel episode. It's almost like all the self-awareness amongst the writing team was just completely lost. Rise of the Numericons, the movie, is the most pointless episode of Rick and Morty. By far. I mean, it's not even a Rick and Morty episode because Rick isn't here. To this day, it's the only episode not to feature him, and God do I miss him. Maybe Rick's commentary could have actually saved this episode from being unwatchable. For some reason, Mr. Goldenfold is the protagonist of this episode. And I think he's really funny, but he is not an interesting character. This is the same problem I had with the Mr. Poopy Butthole episode. Gag characters cannot carry episodes on their own. Morty tags along too, but he doesn't really do anything. He basically just watches this train wreck of an episode implode upon itself. I'm not going to get into the lore behind the Alpha Beatrums because I just don't care. A majority of the episode is just plot exposition and mindless action anyways. Not that this plot really even matters because nobody in the episode takes anything seriously. It's just a stupid parody of Star Wars. And trust me, you probably won't find very many good jokes in this episode either. Well, that is unless you find math puns funny. It honestly just kind of blows my mind how this episode got made. When you clicked on this video, I think you knew exactly what number 1 would be. How could I not talk about the most infamous episode of the entire series? Rick Dependent Spray was the dropping off point for a large portion of the fanbase, and I can't blame them. I don't even know if I can talk about this episode without it getting taken down. That's how foul this episode is. The entire storyline revolves around a 14-year-old's sperm coming to life. Rick is at war with these underground cannibalistic horses that are called freaking chuds. You guys really couldn't come up with a better name. Rick plans to create a bioweapon to kill the chuds using regular horse sperm, but Morty's ends up being mixed in. And if you've already seen the episode, then you know why it gets mixed in. I am not further elaborating. The result is a mutant horde of Morty's offspring. The writing staff really outdone themselves with this one. Did I mention Keith David guest stars in this one? He is an award-winning actor. Why was he wasted in this episode? Rick and Morty get defeated by the Queen of Sperm? What show am I even watching anymore? And then there's the ending of the episode. It's actually canon that Morty and Summer have an incest baby. And I guess this was just such a good idea that they had to bring it back just 3 episodes later. This show has a really weird history with incest that I could probably make a whole video about. I just think it's so strange that I have to end this video talking about incest. I will defend this show with my life, but this episode does not get a pass. Rick Dependent Spray is by far the worst episode of Rick and Morty. It forever left a stain on the reputation of the show. But hey, at least it's an unforgettable experience. So there you have it, the top 10 worst episodes of Rick and Morty. To be honest, most of these episodes aren't even that bad. I truly think the show has managed to maintain a consistently great quality throughout the last decade. In general, I like to be positive, and I think Rick and Morty is a generally great show. But it's been fun to look back at some of the show's weirdest and most insane episodes. Let me know what you thought of this video down in the comments below. If any of you guys have your own list of the top 10 worst episodes, I'd love to see them. Don't forget to like and share the video, and make sure to subscribe. I'm very happy that this update hiatus is over with, and I'll see you guys in the next one.